All right, so let's talk about some more evolution stuff. So there's kind of two categories of evolution. You have microevolution, which is small changes that happen over a relatively short period of time, and those are changes that can be seen in our lifetime, like a species of birds growing bigger bodies, or like viruses mutating, like I said in my other video, bacteria mutating. And then you have macroevolution, which means big changes that happen over very long periods of time. So, for example, wolf-like creatures evolving into modern-day whales. And these are the changes that we see happening in the fossil record versus in everyday life. And evolution can also have different speeds. So you can have gradual change, which is species changing slowly over time. Again, like the whole wolf to elephant, or not elephant, wolf to whale thing. You can have rapid change. Typically, the more drastically your environment changes, the faster you will have to evolve if you want to survive. So again, think of bacteria, viruses, those typically evolve very quickly. Also because they have a shorter lifespan. Things with shorter lifespans evolve more quickly. And sometimes you have extinction, which is when all individuals in a species die and never come back. I want to stress that when something goes extinct, unless you do some weird Frankenstein science stuff, that species will never, ever, ever come back. It's like a one and done type thing. And know that no matter the type of evolution, new species will appear eventually. And there is some debate in the science community as to what technically counts as a species. So take dogs, for example. We typically consider dogs to be a species. However, a species is defined as a group of individuals who are genetically similar enough to mate and have viable offspring. Viable meaning that the offspring can have their own offspring. However, dog breeds have become so different nowadays that some people think that different breeds of dogs should be considered different species, and you can kind of see that if you try to breed like a Chihuahua and a Rottweiler, would that work? Should that work? Kind of a thing. So again, this is kind of a little debate in the science community at the moment. You see the same thing with horses and donkeys and mules. If you breed a horse and a donkey, you get a mule, which is technically a different species, but mules cannot have their own baby mules. So, should they be considered a different species? Scientists disagree. But generally speaking, individuals in a species are those that are genetically similar enough to mate with each other and have viable offspring. So, if we scroll back to the very beginning of time, life started out as very primitive and simple. So, think like, a single cell thing, bacteria, something very, very simple. And as life has evolved, it has gotten more and more advanced and complicated. We're not exactly sure how life started. We know that if you zap water with lightning, it can form into molecules similar to those found in living cells. We know that amino acids are found in asteroids, so it could be possible that asteroids brought life to our planet. Again, we're not 100% sure, but we have some ideas floating around as to how we all got here. And we can use modern DNA studies and like bone structures and things like that to figure out where exactly things evolved from. So there are 3 different types of structures. So the first one is homologous. These are structures that across different animals basically have the same structure, the same bones, but they're used for different purposes. So for example, if you compare a human arm to a bat wing, we see that we all have the same bones. They look a little bit different, but the bones are basically the same. However, we do not use our arms to fly like a bat does. So there's that. And then we have analogous structures. These ones are the opposite. These serve similar purposes, but these structures are not the same at all. So if you compare a bat wing to a bird wing, you see that the little bird fingers are all squished up here, whereas the bat fingers are actually in the wing itself. However, they both use their wings to fly. And then the butterfly over here just straight up doesn't have any bones in it at all. So when we're comparing homologous and analogous structures together, things with homologous structures are more likely to have evolved from a common ancestor. So we would say that we are more closely related to bats than bats are related to birds, for example. And we see that because bats and us are both mammals, birds are their own category, and butterflies are their own separate category. So again, if you're homologous, you probably evolved from a more close common ancestor. You are more genetically similar than you are to your analogous friends. And then we have what's called vestigial structures. These are kind of like evolutionary leftovers that show us how we evolved. So for example, in us, we have this thing called an appendix. An appendix is part of your intestines, and it used to be that your appendix would be used to digest more rough stuff like grass and things like that, but we obviously are not over here eating grass all the time, so we really don't need the appendix anymore. It just kind of hangs out sometimes. Same with goosebumps. It used to be that we had a lot more hair, and when the hair would stand up, it would make us look more scary to predators, that kind of thing. In another animal, you have whales. Whales actually have a pelvis, and when you swim, a pelvis doesn't really do much for you, so we can use the whale's pelvis to assume that whales came from something that also had a pelvis. This is why we know that whales evolved from something that walked on land with legs, because it has this weird leftover pelvis. You also have phylogenetic trees. So when I say phylogenetic tree, I want you to think of like tree of life stuff. So this is what they look like. There's a bunch of different kinds, but basically everywhere you see one of these dots, you have a common ancestor. So for example, looking down at the bottom here, the very bottom, we see that dolphins and cows have a common ancestor. So because of their different types of structures, because of DNA evidence, we know that these two things once evolved from the same creature. And then if we go back one more, we see that they're connected to that looks like a llama. So we know that llamas and cows and dolphins also had a common ancestor, but this one is like once removed, and then you can keep going back and doing that same thing. And if you do that long enough, you'll eventually go back to like the very, very first simple bacteria that ever existed on planet Earth. We can use these to see how closely related we are to other things. So again, going back to the analogous and homologous structures, if you are on totally different branches of a phylogenetic tree, you probably have an analogous structure. If you are closer to something on a phylogenetic tree, you probably have a homologous structure because you evolved from the same common ancestor. And if you have vestigial things left over, we can use those to help figure out where exactly you belong on the phylogenetic tree. And also with vestigial things, sometimes they disappear completely because if you don't need them, you can end up losing them. For example, there are species of fish that live in caves with zero sunlight, and most of them don't have eyeballs because why would you need eyeballs if you live in a cave with zero sunlight? And again, things go from very simple to very complicated. If we look at the tree of life, it starts off with bacteria, which is simple. And then it gets a little bit more complicated with eukaryotes, with our nucleuses and stuff. And I think that's about it.